Good morning. Happy Mother's Day. Great day. Not a job more rewarding than that of being a mom, but there's also, it's not a job in the world more demanding and maybe even more difficult than being a mother. There isn't a job with less pay or more responsibility than that of being a mother. But see, mothers have the opportunity to mold the lives of their children, their sons and their daughters for the rest of their lives. And possibly the greatest thing a mother can do in front of her children or for her children is just simply be a Christian. Turn your Bibles to 1 Samuel 1. 1 Samuel 1, we're going to look at a neat story here about a woman of faith. 1 Samuel 1, begin reading with me. Verses 1 through 5 here, 1 Samuel 1. There was a certain man from Ramathaim, a Zuphite from the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, the son of Jeroam, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. He had two wives. One was called Hannah and the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. Year after year, this man went up from his town to worship and sacrifice to the Lord Almighty at Shiloh, where Hophni and Phinehas, the two sons of Eli, were priests of the Lord. Whenever the day came for Elkanah to sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to his wife Peninnah and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion because he loved her and the Lord had closed her womb. I want to begin with you this morning with this reality that women of faith endure real problems. You know, for us to think that because we're people of faith, that our life will be smooth, that our life will always be rosy, that we'll never have ups and downs and trials and tribulations and hardships and even go through things in this life that we're questioning. I don't know why this is happening. I don't know why this is happening even now. Women of faith endure real problems. And see, for Hannah, the problem was the Lord had closed her womb. She had no children. She couldn't have children. And her husband's other wife, Peninnah, had sons and daughters. So she had multiple children. Now, if that were not bad enough, in verses 6 through 8, it says, and because the Lord had closed her womb, her rival, that would be Peninnah, kept provoking her in order to irritate her. This went on year after year. Whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept and would not eat. Elkanah, her husband, would say to her, Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? So not only was she barren, not only had the Lord closed her womb, she had no children. It appeared that she would never have children. Her husband's other wife had plenty of children and would provoke her, not supportive of her at all, but would provoke her, may even say things to her like, well, you know our husband loves me more because I've given him sons and daughters. You know that God has shown more favor to me because I have sons and daughters, and you have no children. God doesn't love you. Your husband, our husband Elkanah, doesn't love you. But all of this, year after year, constant pressure and stress and provoking, women of faith endure real problems. Do you remember what happened with Job even? You see, the righteous do endure suffering. He lost his livelihood. He lost his children. He lost his health. And you say, yes, but he gained it all back and then some at the end of the story. Absolutely. But at the beginning, do you think he was thinking, well, it's no big deal. I know I'm going to get it back and even more. Absolutely not. He just continued to live out his faith every day. And that's what women of faith must do. In Genesis 16, Sarah makes a decision that comes back to haunt her, you might say. In verses 3 and following, it says, so after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian maidservant Hagar and gave to her to be her husband, or gave her to her husband, to be his wife. He slept with Hagar and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. And Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong I'm suffering. I put my servant in your arms, and now she knows she is pregnant. She despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." So she went through a similar thing than what Hannah was going through. Women of faith endure real problems. But here's the thing. We cannot allow others to deter our trust in God. When we're dealing with real problems, it's then that we need to rely and trust in God more and not turn away from God. Temptation is to quit. Temptation is to turn away. Temptation is to throw in the towel. Well, I didn't get that job, or my boss doesn't like me as much, or we're having a lot of marital issues. I mean, we could go on and on. We all deal with problems, even people of faith. But verse 7 is an interesting verse to me. In 1 Samuel 1:7, it says, "This went on year after year whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord." And see, she would go to the house of the Lord to pray. And so she never stopped, even though the Lord had kept her from having children, closed her womb. Year after year, she would continue to go to the house of the Lord to pray. So even when we're going through real problems in life, we cannot allow anyone or anything to deter our trust in God. Let's move on. Secondly, women of faith extend vibrant prayers. I want us to break this prayer down of Hannah. She goes to the house of the Lord, and I want you to hear her prayer, and you can almost feel the emotion in her prayer. In verse 10, 1 Samuel 1 verse 10, it says, "In bitterness of soul, Hannah wept. She cried as she prayed." She's hurting. "I have no children. My rival continues to torment me." And the husband, Elkanah, is caught in the middle. But in bitterness of soul, Hannah wept much, and she prayed to the Lord. So her prayer with bitterness of soul, weeping in anguish. And notice verse 11. And in the midst of this prayer, she made a vow saying, "O Lord Almighty, if you will only look upon your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head." Hannah makes a vow. She's weeping. She's crying in the midst of a prayer. And then she says, "God, if you'll just remember me, if you'll just give me one son, I'll give him back to you for all of his life. No razor ever touching his hair." And I think that speaks of the devotion. He's yours. I'm not going to do anything. He's yours. If you'll just let me bear this one child. Look at verse 12. As she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. You've done that before. Eli thought she was drunk and said to her, "How long will you keep on getting drunk? Get rid of your wine." "No, not so, my Lord," Hannah replied, verse 15. "I'm a woman who is deeply troubled. I've not been drinking wine or beer. I've been pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I've been praying here out of my great anguish and grief." So she prays in her bitterness of soul. She's weeping in anguish. She is, verse 12, she's persistent. She's praying with her heart, praying from her soul, makes this vow to God. If you'll just remember this prayer, if you'll just remember me, hear and answer this prayer, I'll give the boy to you. Devote him to you forever. If you'll just answer this prayer. I like verse 12. As she kept on praying. Persistence. Are you persistent in prayer? Because Hannah was. She just continued to pray and lay this burden at the Lord's feet, and this request even, with her heart, her soul. Hold your place there and look at Colossians 4 with me for a second. I want to show you a few New Testament passages. Colossians chapter 4. It says, devote yourselves to prayer, being watchful and thankful. She prayed persistently, continued steadfastly in prayer. Hannah prayed fervently. She put her soul into her prayers. It was as if she could feel her prayer. You say, I don't understand what that means. She's crying, physically crying. When you're crying, it's because you feel something. That's an emotion. Maybe you feel it emotionally, you're hurt, or physically you're hurting. But she, in tears, weeping before the Lord. In 1 John chapter 5, verses 14 and 15. It says, this is the confidence we have in approaching God, that if we ask anything according to His will, He hears us. That's the good news. If we ask anything according to His will, He hears us. And if we know that He hears us, whatever we ask, we know that we have what we asked of Him. She prayed faithfully, persistently, believing that God would answer her prayers. You see, if she didn't believe God would answer her prayers, why would she go year after year? Why would she continue to pour her heart and her soul and her tears into these prayers, these requests before the Father? She believed God would answer her prayers. You see, women of faith endure real problems, absolutely. But women of faith extend vibrant prayers. Let's move on next. Women of faith experience God's provisions. Look at verses 19 and 20. Back in 1 Samuel 1. It says, early the next morning they arose and they worshiped before the Lord and then went back to their home at Ramah. Elkanah lay with Hannah his wife, and the Lord remembered her. God remembered her. God answered her prayer. So in the course of time, Hannah conceived and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, saying, because I asked the Lord for him. So women of faith experience God's provision. Hannah experienced God's provision as God remembered her. He gave her a son. She names him Samuel because Samuel means heard of God. God heard me. I know God heard me because I was barren. I was without child, couldn't have children. God heard me. And God gave me a son. Women of faith experience God's provision. And there's two keys in experiencing God's provisions. Write these down. You can. I would. I did. Let me go back to 1 John with you a minute. 1 John 5. Two keys to experience God's provisions. I don't think that's on the PowerPoint. Verse 14. 1 John 5. This is the confidence we have in approaching God, that if we ask anything according to His will, He hears us. Every prayer I pray needs to be according to His will. Why? Because He knows what's best. He sees tomorrow. He sees next week. He sees 6 months from now. He knows what's best for you in every situation. It may not quite go the way you want it to or the way you think it should, but He knows what's best. And if we're praying according to His will, we're always going to have what we ask, because His will be done. Always. So that's the first thing. The first key in experiencing God's provision, pray according to God's will. But the next one is this, in John 15. In verse 7. It says, if you remain in me, if you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish and it'll be given to you. But the second key is remain in me. Be faithful to me. Remain in fellowship with me. Maintain the relationship with me. So if I ask anything according to God's will, according to His will, because He knows what's best. I think I do. I think I know this is the way it should work out. I think this would be best for me and my family. But He knows what's best every time. So I pray according to His will, and I remain in Him. Two keys to experience God's provisions. Now let's look at something else that's the complete opposite of that. In James chapter 4, in verse 3, we're going to get back to our story in a minute. In James 4 in verse 3, he says, when you ask, in other words, when you pray, you do not receive because you ask with wrong motives, that you may spend what you get on yourselves. He said, you're not praying according to my will. It's about you. And I'll give you a hint. In the Christian life, it's just never, and I know we're not supposed to say the word never, but it's never about you and me. Daily denial of self says it's never about me. It's never about you. Our prayers are not about us. God always provides for us. May not be what I want, may not be what I expect, but He does provide always. Matthew 6:33. We'll seek first His kingdom and His righteousness. All these things will be given to us. And what He means is the food and the shelter. I'll provide what you need. I'll take care of your necessities if you'll just seek me. Pray according to His will. Remain in Him. Romans 8:28, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who've been called according to His purpose. It's going to work out for you. God will see to it. Women of faith experience God's provisions. But let's move on. I've got two more. Back in our story. Women of faith excel at keeping promises. Go back to verse 11 with me, 1 Samuel 1:11. Remember in her prayer, Hannah made a vow saying, "Oh Lord Almighty, if you will only look upon your servant's misery and remember me and not forget your servant, but give her a son that I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life. No razor will ever be used on his head." That's the vow. You give me a son. You remember me. You give me a son. He's yours. I will give him to you for his whole life. From now on, you have him. He's yours. And look at verse 22. Hannah did not go. She said to her husband, "After the boy is weaned, I'll take him and present him before the Lord, and he will live there always." She had full intention of keeping her vow. She makes this vow to the Lord in this fervent prayer, and God remembers her. He answers that prayer, and she is completely intent on keeping and maintaining that vow. Verses 24 through 28. Hannah carried out what she promised to the Lord. After he was weaned, she took the boy with her, young as he was, and he would have been young, along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine. She brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh. When they had slaughtered the bull, they brought the boy to Eli, and she said to him, "As surely as you live, my Lord, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child, and the Lord had granted me what I asked of him, so now I give him to the Lord for his whole life. He will be given over to the Lord." And he worshiped the Lord there. She kept her vow. Let me read a few things for you. As we think about vows, and when we think about vows, what comes to mind? Nothing, really. Marriage vows. You're going, huh? Marriage vows. I just did a wedding 4 weeks ago today. Marriage vows. Marriage vows. And then when we make a vow to our children, or we make a vow to our friends, or we make a vow to God. When you're baptized into Christ, what are you saying? I'm following you. Today, yeah. And tomorrow, and the day after. From now on, I'm following you. You're making a vow. Well, look at Ecclesiastes chapter 5 real quick. These vows mean something to God. Verses 4 and 5, when you make a vow to God, do not delay in fulfilling it. He has no pleasure in fools. Fulfill your vow. It is better not to vow than to make a vow and not fulfill it. If you make a vow, keep it. If you say, this is what I'm going to do it. Matthew chapter 5. Matthew 5, the Sermon on the Mount. Listen to what Jesus says about these oaths and vows. He says in verse 33, again, you've heard that it was said to the people long ago, do not break your oath, but keep the oaths that you've made to the Lord. But I tell you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Listen, and do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. Simply let your yes be yes, and your no, no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. We're going, what does that mean? Say what you mean and mean what you say. If you say, I'm going to do it, do it. And there are those people out there, if they tell you they're going to do it, they're going to do it. And you know what? That's the kind of people we need to be. Hannah made a promise. An empty promise just to get her way? I don't think so. She made a vow. God, if you'll just remember me, if you'll just give me this son one time, I'm going to give him to you. And as soon as she weaned that child, she took him to the house of the Lord and gave Samuel to Eli. Willingly kept her vow that she made to the Lord. How many times have you said, God, if you'll just get me through this, God, if you'll just get me through this situation, I promise, and you can fill in the blank, I'll never miss Sunday morning again. God, if you'll just help me make it here, I will read my Bible every day. God, if you'll just help my wife and I to get along, I will. Those are vows. But are they empty vows to persuade God to give you what you think you want or need? Or do you mean it? And Hannah meant it. She made a huge vow to God and kept that vow. I wonder sometimes the discussion that took place between Hannah and Elkanah, or if there was much discussion about taking Samuel to the Lord's house at Shiloh. But she wasn't deterred one bit, no matter the discussion, if there was any. I don't really know. She had made a vow and she was going to make good on the vow. So women of faith endure real problems. They extend vibrant prayers, experience God's provisions, and excel at keeping promises. And finally this morning as we close out, women of faith express their praise. Now, I would encourage you to read 1 Samuel chapter 2, 1 through 10. For the sake of time, I'm not going to read all of that, but I'm going to read the first two verses just to kind of shed some light on what's going on. Hannah prays. She's just dropped her child at the temple of the Lord, and she prays, and it's a prayer of praise. You say, well, I pray all the time. This is an interesting prayer because it's praise. Hannah prayed and said, my heart rejoices in the Lord, chapter 2, verse 1. My heart rejoices in the Lord. In the Lord my horn is lifted high. My mouth boasts over my enemies, for I delight in your deliverance. There is no one holy like the Lord. There is no one besides you. There is no rock like our God. So Hannah offers a prayer of praise to the Lord. And again, read through verse 10 in your time. We rejoice in our blessings, the blessings that we receive, and we should. 1 Thessalonians 5:16 says, be joyful always. Be joyful always. The psalmist in Psalm 18, verse 49. Therefore I will praise you among the nations, O Lord. I will sing praises to your name. Hebrews 13 and 15. Real quick. Through Jesus, therefore, let us continually offer to God a sacrifice of praise, the fruit of lips that confess His name. Praising God is how we offer spiritual sacrifices to God. And how many of us offer these prayers of thanksgiving and prays to God. See, we want our prayers answered. There's not anybody in here that doesn't want their prayers answered. We want our prayers answered, but so many of our prayers is, God, give me this, God, do this, God, do that. God, if you'll just fix this, if you'll take care of that. And I'm not saying that's wrong, don't misunderstand me, but how many times? I want you to think about the situation. This is a key point in Hannah's life. She's been a woman of faith, no question. Year after year she's going and she's offering these prayers and praying through her tears to God. Just answer this one prayer, God, and I'll give the boy to you. And he does, and she does. She takes the boy Samuel, drops him at the temple of the Lord, and then praises God. And offers a prayer of praise to God at this critical time in her life. We want our prayers answered, but do we praise Him for that? How many of you run back? I say run back because you remember the lepers. How many were there? 10? And they're cleansed. And how many return to say thank you? 1? Sometimes I wonder if that's us. God, I pray you'll heal this person. God, I pray you'll open this person's heart to the gospel. And then we see those things happen, whatever it be. How many of us run back to say thank you? Thank you. Or do we just continue on like we expect that to be there? We expect Him to answer our prayers, and not only answer our prayers, but answer them the way we want. How many of us express prayers of praise? Boy, women of faith. That's what we need to do. Hannah was a great woman of faith, set a great example for us all. Today, if we can reach out to you and help you anyway, if you're struggling with something and need prayers of this family, we want to be there for you. We're going to have an elder up here waiting for you. We're willing and able and ready to immerse you into Christ this morning to have your sins washed away and start you a new life if that's your need today. Would you come? As together we stand and as we sing.